Before we get started, please don't forget to rate and review wherever possible. It really helps our podcast find the ears of listeners just like you. Also, if you have a story to tell, don't forget to submit it via email at contact@campfirecultpod.com or leave a voicemail message at 720-297-8608. You can also follow us anywhere socially at Campfire Cult Pod and visit us online at campfirecultpod.com. Welcome, dear listener, to the Campfire Cult Podcast. From a camper van deep in the haunted woods, I bring you first-hand accounts of chilling encounters with the paranormal. Step into the night and take a peek into the realm where reality and the supernatural collide. My name is Jazz, and I'll be your host. In the mysterious expanse of North America's northern woodlands, there are whispers of the enigmatic Wendigo. Hunters and campers recount eerie encounters with this emaciated entity that some claim is nearly invisible from the side due to its unnaturally thin form. Rooted in Native American folklore, the Wendigo, standing over 10 feet tall, embodies a once human turned ravenous creature. The Algonquin people in the early 20th century associated numerous unexplained disappearances with the Wendigo, dubbing it the spirit of lonely places. Described as skeletal, with desiccated skin stretching over bones, adorned with antlers, having tattered, bloody flesh-suffering suppurations, and an ashen complexion that stinks of decay. A truly horrific aspect of this creature is its deceptive prowess. Instead of chasing down its prey, the Wendigo employs mimicry of familiar human voices to lure the unsuspecting victim into isolation, where it attacks and devours them, never to be seen again. Dear listeners, tonight we embark on a journey into the eerie depths of the haunted woods, where the elusive Wendigo prowls. Join me as we delve into chilling tales of spine-tingling encounters with this terrifying beast. Now, on to our first encounter. In the remote depths of the Arizona desert, a dad has an encounter with a mysterious creature disguised in the skin of a seemingly lifeless animal on a late-night drive down a desolate highway.
This happened a long time ago, before my mom and dad were even married. They lived in different states for a short period because of their work. I don't remember where my mom lived, but my dad was in Arizona. So when my mom visited, he would have to drive a relatively far distance to pick her up and drop her back off. Not only was it far, but the only road there was in the middle of the desert. So basically in the middle of nowhere. One time, after my dad had dropped off my mom at the airport, it was pretty late at night and pitch black, except for the light from the car's headlights. On this road, even during the day, he could have been the only car on it. But this late at night, it was just him all alone on this lonely highway. My dad was driving back home after dropping my mom off when he noticed something on his side of the road. He slowed down to see what it was and saw what looked like a fairly big animal laying down and appearing to be dead. My dad told me he was fairly certain it was a deer, but he was looking at the animal from inside his car, so he couldn't be certain. All of a sudden, the animal's head popped up and it sat up straight and just stared at him, watching the car as it drove by. He said he saw the skin of the animal pulled around what looked like a figure of a person inside of it, as if it was wearing it as a costume or something. It could also have been a zombie deer by the look of it. He told me as he was driving, he could feel and hear something running alongside the car, and he started to panic because it was that dead deer thing. My dad is not a religious man, but as he was saying a prayer, he finally felt like he had lost that thing that had been chasing him and terrifyingly keeping up with his car. My dad said he wasn't sure if it was something supernatural, but that he just felt an immense amount of fear in that moment and that he was in grave danger. To this day, without any answers for what he saw, he's refused to drive on that road at night ever again.
Coming up, in a small rural town in Ohio, a routine exploration of the neighborhood woods turns into a chilling encounter with a mimic beckoning them deeper into the shadows of the forest.
This incident occurred sometime in the fall of 2006. I grew up in a rural part of Ohio. My house had fairly dense woods located directly behind it. As a child, I had a passion for exploring. I especially loved exploring those woods. It was my favorite place to be. Prior to the incident, I had wandered through those woods many times, always with my mother's permission. There was one tree in particular that I frequently enjoyed to climb, usually about to the halfway mark so I could perch myself on one of the heavier branches and just relax as I listened to the peaceful sounds of nature. Climbing that tree for the very first time was quite an accomplishment. From that position, I could partially see the back of my house. On that day, after a fair amount of exploring, I carefully scaled my favorite tree. I seated myself on a sturdy branch and took in the view. Naturally, being late in October, the sun inevitably began to set within a few minutes. I always felt a little saddened to see the darkness approaching. The woods were like my own little sanctuary. I could entertain myself out there for hours. When darkness began to fall, however, my mother would stand at the edge of the woods and call my name until I obediently returned home, so not to be stranded out there after dark. After watching the sun set until I could no longer see it, I began my descent down the tree. I was nearly at the bottom when I heard my mother's familiar voice calling my name.
Adam.
I thought nothing of it at first, as this routine had occurred plenty of times before. Then I realized something strange as my feet touched the ground.
Adam,
My
come
mother's
here.
voice was coming from behind me, deeper in the woods rather than towards the entrance where she always stood when she called me home.
Adam,
My mom had never entered those woods before, at least not with me. I was eager to find her and show her all of my favorite spots before it grew too dark. That's when I realized something was off. How could she have gone into the woods ahead of me? Certainly I could have missed her, but as I said, she never entered those woods. She continued calling my name,
Adam,
but there was
are you
something
out
strange about it. She sounded absolutely frantic, almost
Come
angry.
here
Fearing
now.
that I was in trouble for reasons currently unknown, I froze in place. As her voice drew closer,
Adam?
I squinted my eyes to see if I could locate her and determine exactly how angry or upset she appeared to be. However, I didn't see anyone or anything unusual. Suddenly, I heard her voice calling my
Adam,
name
come
from the
here.
direction of my house, sounding much calmer. Seconds later, from somewhere within the woods yet again,
Adam,
it wasn't an
come
echo.
here.
I wasn't imagining things. I was literally hearing her beckoning me from the edge of our
Adam.
backyard, as well as ahead of me.
Come here.
My legs suddenly turned to jelly. I couldn't quite comprehend what was going on.
Come here right now.
The voice that I originally believed to be her screamed from just ahead. I realized that whoever or whatever was mimicking my mother was drawing closer. I didn't question which voice was actually my mother's, as there was something about the way it sounded that unnerved me. Terrified of what I would see if I stood there much longer, I turned around and ran towards the exit of the woods as quickly as my legs could possibly carry me. It was amazing that I didn't trip over anything in my haste. Even though my house wasn't very far away from where I had been standing, those woods had never seemed larger to me than they did in that moment. From behind me, my mother's voice continued to call my name,
Adam,
now sounding desperate.
come here.
Panic set in as my actual mother
here
finally
right
came into
now.
view, waiting patiently as she usually did until I returned home. In my frightened state, I absolutely refused to look back. As soon as I was out of the woods and in the backyard next to my mother, the other voice was suddenly gone. Rather than fading away, it seemed to stop the very moment I stepped foot into my backyard. I must have looked as frightened as I felt, because my mother asked me what was wrong. Slowly but surely, my panic subsided. I didn't say anything until we were safely in the house with our doors locked. I asked my mother if she had entered the woods. Appearing confused by the question, she told me that of course she hadn't. With that confirmation, I hesitantly asked her if she had heard anyone else calling my name and yelling. The answer to that question was also no. Although I was still very much shaken up, I managed to explain everything that happened as clearly and rationally as possible. My mother was surprisingly nonchalant about the whole situation, explaining that I must have imagined it, that I was spending too much time out there by myself. The incident in those woods have stayed with me to this day. I can still hear that voice as clear as a bell. Whoever or whatever it was calling my name sounded exactly like my mother, but I know it wasn't her. Not only was she waiting for me outside, but the voice also sounded strange in a way that I still can't fully explain. I didn't go back into the woods until I was 17 years old, and even then, I never hung out for very long. I've carefully gone over every possible explanation, but none of them seem entirely plausible. It certainly wasn't my mother playing a prank. There was no way she could have pulled it off. Not to mention the fact that she's never been one to play pranks. I also highly doubt that it was anyone else because, as I stated before, we lived in a rural area. The closest neighbor was at least a mile away, and I wasn't personally acquainted with any of them. How could they have known my name and where to find me? We've since moved out of that house, but my mother and I occasionally discuss the incident. She still claims that she never heard or saw anything unusual out there. I know it probably shouldn't, but what happened in those woods continues to bother me. I spent many hours out there prior to that day, and never had anything out of the ordinary occur. The best explanation I have at this point is a doppelganger or possibly a Wendigo, but I'm unsure. If anyone has a possible explanation as to what might have happened, I'd love to hear it.
Next, at the age of 11, a boy encounters an entity that mimics the voice of his mother, trying to lure him outside the house.
Back when I was around 11, my third oldest brother was at his grade 8 graduation, and I was left home alone. For some context, I'm Canadian, and at the time lived with my mother in an area surrounded by forest. I was home alone, and around maybe 5 p.m., I went out to put our chickens away. All of my roosters were on high alert, which wasn't strange, except that a few wouldn't let me leave the coop, which isn't normal. I had around 3 roosters blocking the door, so after maybe 15 minutes of struggling, I had gotten out. I locked the door, and as I was heading inside, I heard branches and sticks cracking, as if someone was stepping on them. Totally creeped out, I bolted inside and slammed my front door shut, locking it. I didn't get 3 steps from my door before I heard knocking and my mother's voice begging me to open the door because she forgot something. I knew it wasn't her as I watched her leave with my younger siblings and stepfather. In a panic, I ran upstairs and ran to my room, closing the door and locking it. The pounding and begging continued for a few more minutes, and I covered my ears, not wanting to hear it anymore. After a little bit, I began to hear tapping and knocking on my top window, which was pretty high up. I started hearing a voice mimic some family members' voices, saying stuff like, "Open the door," or "You're grounded," and "Open the damn door," and screaming. I didn't know what to do, but my 11-year-old mind decided on screaming and pleading for it to leave me alone, which wasn't smart as it led to it getting louder, as if it was feeding off my fear. After maybe 40 minutes, it stopped, and I thought it was over. We lived off-grid, and my house's generator shut off all of a sudden, even though I know it was full of fuel because I filled it today. Shaken up, I knew I had to go outside to check on it. So I grabbed a metal baseball bat we had by the door and went outside, shaking and crying. I checked it, and there was no fuel. I heard some weird sounds and saw my cat, totally puffed up and freaked out. Panicking now, I grabbed my cat, put him in my bag, and ran back home crying. My mom ended up coming home after an hour or two, and my stepdad dealt with the generator while my mom scolded me for being silly and overreacting. It was pretty windy, so I made up an excuse saying I thought a tornado was coming, which she didn't believe at all. After that, they left again, and I watched the truck drive off and instantly felt eyes on me. Quickly scooping up my cat, I went inside, locking the door, and it started again.
Can you
The
open
pounding
the door,
and
please?
mimicking. I sat in bed crying,
Open the
scared
door.
and confused, wondering why it was happening to me.
Can you open
After
the
a
door,
while,
please?
it had gotten dark out, being around maybe 8 or 9 now, and I could see a shadow of the thing banging on the door
Open the
because
door.
the moon was full. It was very tall and had these deer-like antlers. Its hand came around the corner of the wall, and I quickly covered my window. The tapping got worse, and the voices were changing again. I don't know whose voices it was
open the door,
mimicking
please?
now, but I was scared. I ended up crying myself to sleep while my cat tried to comfort me. I'm not sure when it stopped, but it was going on for a while, and then my mom came home, and it stopped for good. I was shaken up for a few days and very jumpy. I'm still scared of the forest to this day. I'm almost 25 now. I ended up confessing to my mom about all of this years later, and she said it sounded demonic. She was going to talk to my stepfather about it, as he is native and may know what it was. I love visiting my parents, but think about this every time I come for a visit. Hasn't happened since, but is always on my mind when I'm there.
Next up, a camping trip with friends takes a strange turn when they encounter a very deformed deer.
Last weekend, one of my friends brought up the idea of camping. At first, I was opposed to it as it's fall and cold outside, and the idea of having to sleep in a tent with another person just didn't seem appealing. But when all 6 of us talked about it, I realized that maybe it wasn't such a bad idea after all. We decided to do it next weekend, aka now. This morning we went out and bought everything we needed: tents, beers, a lighter, and a couple of more things that don't need mentioning. We decided it would be best to do it in the woods 2 hours away from any road or houses. I was particularly upset about that, as anything could happen from some random person attacking us, even a bear sneaking into our tents. But we'd have our car parked on the nearest road, so if anything did happen, we could just run to it. At least that's what some others said. I brought up the fact it's a 2-hour walk, but of course I was ignored. We drove as far as we could before we got out to start walking. I noticed a few things. First of all, no sounds of wildlife. No crickets, no birds, no nothing making a sound. And it felt odd, like something was slightly off. I chalked it up to my nerves acting up and ignored it. "Where should we set the tents up at?" Rob asked, taking a puff of his joint. "Right over there looks good," Nate replied, motioning for Rob to pass it to him. "Who's setting it up?" After a little conversation, we decided Dan and Murphy could do it, while the rest of us goes out to see if we can find any squirrels to hunt. I doubted it. It didn't exactly seem like this place was crawling with wildlife. "Grab my rifle, would ya?" I grabbed it and threw it at him. Don't worry, it wasn't loaded yet. He catches it, saying a quick thanks, and off we went. We were out for hours looking to no avail. There was absolutely nothing. I didn't even see any bugs. "Maybe we should go on back now. We can eat the stuff we brought," I suggested. Rob and Nate stopped walking, to which I assumed meant they agreed. We turned back around and started walking back towards camp. After a couple of minutes of walking, I heard a sound. It was quiet, but we all heard it. We stopped walking to look around. Behind us, there was a deer. Except it wasn't at all normal. Its horns were growing out of its mouth, and it had 5 legs. I had never seen anything like it before, but I've heard of it. Deformed deers, I wasn't too worried. We decided not to kill it because we definitely weren't about to eat it, being too worried about catching some type of disease. I wondered, though, how long has that deer been following us? Being so silent that we hadn't even noticed it? We made it back to camp about an hour later. We ended up eating some cans of chili we brought with us, cooking it over the fire we made. The 5 of us were sharing tents, 2 in one and 3 in another. I was sharing with Nate. Robert, Murphy, and Dan were in the other. We stayed up for a few more hours singing songs and drinking beer before we headed off to bed. I fell asleep about an hour after laying down. Then I woke up to a clicking noise. It took me a second to register what was happening. I assumed it was one of the guys doing something, but just in case, I grabbed my gun and unzipped the tent. I froze. The deer from before was standing outside my tent, its mouth moving weirdly. Its teeth were clicking against each other every few seconds from the weird movement. It followed us all the way back? How did we not notice? I zipped the tent back and tried to ignore it. Needless to say, I got no sleep that night. The next morning, all 6 of us decided to stay one more night before packing up to leave. It was weird. I felt like something was messing with my mind, that my brain wasn't working correctly. I was scared. I just didn't know of what. I spent all evening wondering what was wrong with my mind. I could tell the others felt the same way. That night, all 6 of us went to sleep, 3 in one and 3 in another. I was with Nate and someone else I can't remember. Something felt wrong, but I just couldn't put my foot on it. That night, I woke up to the same clicking noise as last night, this time from inside the tent. I was too scared to move. Had the deer somehow made it into the tent? I felt Nate shift to get up. "What the?" I heard him say before he went silent, cutting off whatever he was about to say. "What the hell?" I heard him say again, slightly louder this time. I felt something move on my left side, which was strange because Nate was on my right side. Oh shit," I heard before I felt someone leap over me onto Nate. I woke up the next morning panting. Was it all a dream? I wondered. All 6 of us packed up to leave. Something still felt wrong. Nate was off. He talked the same and acted the same, but it was the way he looked. Have you ever heard of Uncanny Valley? He just didn't look real. He looked animated versus being human, if that makes sense. I just knew something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it, so I ignored it. And with that, all 6 of us walked to the car, got in, and took off. Never to talk about it again, but thinking about it often.
Next, a curious and unsuspecting girl experiences terrifying encounters with a mysterious disembodied voice that mimics a family member.
When I was younger, me, my cousin, we'll call her N, and our aunt, we'll call her J, went for a walk outdoors down the holler. Well, me being the curious little kid I was, I walked down over the hill on the other side of the road. I got a little way down the hill, and on down the hill towards my right, I hear my cousin's voice.
Savannah, come here.
At first, I thought it was N, but I didn't see her. The area down the hill was visible everywhere, just skinny little trees and flat land. It confused me and made me feel a bit uneasy because it was obvious there were no humans nor animals that I could see there. I walked down a little further to where her voice last came from, and again I hear,
Hurry up, come on!
And this time it was a little further down than where it had been. I knew something was up because she wasn't there, no one was there.
Hey, come down here.
I got scared and yelled for my aunt. They both walked over to the side of the road looking down at me. I was scared and confused, because I know for a fact what had just went on. I told my aunt and cousin. They both swore and promised it wasn't neither of them. My cousin had been with her standing up on the road, so it wasn't her. The voice of N was coming from downhill trying to lure me away.
Hurry up, come on!
Of course they looked and had seen nothing. The voice just seemed to be coming from air in front of me.
Hey, come down here.
The next day or two, I was out on the front porch playing by myself, as they said in the house. Note that these encounters and the disembodied voice, I smelt a strong scent of pennies. I looked over and seen like 50 baby black snakes crawling over each other, staying in the same place. In my mind, something kept wanting me to go over to the snakes, but I didn't. I ran and got Aunt Jay to come out to see them. As soon as we got out there, the stench and the snakes were gone. As soon as she went back in the house, the snakes came right back. I hollered, but of course she wouldn't come back because it was my imagination. I got creeped out and went inside for the next day or two. When I finally got brave enough to go back outside, I kept feeling like I needed to walk down the road towards the old garage. I wanted to face my fears of not leaving the porch and get on with my life. Well, as soon as I got towards the other side of the garage, there was this huge buck standing on its hind legs, staring at me. I froze in fear because its big black eyes were staring through my soul. It acted human. I kicked into flight mode as soon as I turned my body to run, keeping my eyes glued on it. It opened its mouth and talked in Aunt Jay's voice.
Come over here, Rose.
I ran, and when I did, it was screaming, mimicking Jay.
Come back here, Rose.
Rose is my middle name, by the way. By the time I hit the door, I was bawling, because I knew Jay wouldn't believe me. That scream has scarred me and stuck with me to this day. I told my aunt and mama, and in a way I think they kind of believed me because I was crying and being as serious as a heart attack. I never wanted to go outside after that. It seemed it kept trying to lure me and convince me to come to it. Any ideas what it is? What it wanted? Why it followed me home and stalked me?
Come back here, Rose.
We're now nearing the end of our episode, where in the beautiful expanse of the Big Horn Mountains in Wyoming, a man finds himself thrust into a chilling encounter with the supernatural.
There is no easy way to tell the tale of facing a Wendigo. I won't give my name away, so my name will be Alex due to the severity of this story. Please know, this story is 100% true, without an over-exaggeration or embellishment. On September 13th, 2016, I was driving up the Big Horn Mountains above Buffalo, Wyoming. Just like every trip, I packed accordingly. 2 bottles of water, 6 Nutri-Grain bars, and my loaded handgun. I drove up 4 to 5 times per week, never thinking of ghost stories or monsters being in the area. As far as I knew, these mountains were harmless besides predators seldomly seen and weather interference. But something in me changed on September 13th. Instead of going to my usual neck of the woods, I went to a remote campsite known as Hettinger, 15 miles up from town. It's a beautiful place where if you cross the fence, you can climb to a peak and see for days. As I was looking over the majestic snow-covered landscape, I saw a tall, slender figure marching through the deep powder. Normally I would think it was a hunter on the move, but Hettinger was far from any known hunting locations. To this day, I wish I would have packed up and left. I wish I didn't peek through my binoculars, but sometimes curiosity is the only option. I'll never let myself forget the moment I peered through the cold glass over the winter plateau. As I focused my lenses and the figure came to clarity, I dropped behind the rocks. It was looking back at me, as if it could see me. That would be impossible for a human. I was 1,000 feet away or more, hidden by a rock and within the tree line. I peeked back up, using only the top of my head to look again. It was just standing there, sniffing the air while looking at me. My heart sank and I couldn't move. I was frozen in fear. About 200 feet behind me was a small rock cave, big enough to squeeze into and deep enough to hide in the dark. I slowly made my way, inching backwards. I took one last look and noticed it was sprinting towards me. I moved as fast as possible to the hole and tucked in. The moment I made it, the creature was standing feet from where I was. Its skin was damp in appearance and gray. It was tall and bony. It also had long hands and fingers to match that turned to dagger-like nails. I cupped my mouth to hide my breathing, which became a challenge due to the cold. But as I moved my hand, a rock tumbled. I looked down at the rock just to look back up and see its cold eyes peering through the hole. It was almost as if it couldn't see me, but it knew something was there. I stood still as a statue. It reached in, almost grasping my pack. After 5 minutes of forever, it gave up and took back to sniffing. I waited there in shock, and a daunting weight of fright casting over me with every moment that passed. It quickly got dark as night fell and it finally took off. I waited until I felt it was okay to poke my head out. I took a look around and saw nothing, not even a footprint. I took my time and watched my steps to stay quiet and made my way back down to my car. I used my key to unlock it, rather than using the button lock because I didn't want the car to beep. I got in and sank down and took a last look around. I finally found courage to crank my car and began to drive down the trail to the main highway. As I was just about turned around, I saw it. It stood as tall as the trees and stared at me. I hit the gas and fishtailed, but I made it. As I reached the main road, it was in pursuit and was keeping up. After a few miles, I looked back and it was gone. To this day, I haven't been back, not even to that region of the mountains. Stay safe and know the world is far more vast than we know.
For our final story of the evening, in the quaint woods of western Pennsylvania, a seasoned camper and former Boy Scout finds himself embarking on an unusual cold weather camping trip with friends that takes a turn, as a bizarre encounter leaves him questioning the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural.
At the time of writing this, I am living in western Pennsylvania, a little south of Pittsburgh. I was in Boy Scouts for most of my life, so I feel very comfortable in the woods and go camping often. Upon hearing Governor Wolf's school closure plan, I decided that it was time for some cold weather camping. It was March. It wasn't that cold, but it did drop to 40 degrees at night, and the people who I went with weren't really avid campers. If you're from Pittsburgh, you may know the Boggs campsite on the Montour Trail. That's where we went. They, of course, only brought weed and alcohol and didn't bring any sleeping bags, blankets, or pillows, so naturally, I assumed they were going to have to sit by the fire all night. It was light when we first got there, and the fire pit was still smoldering. Very cool. We used the coals from the previous camper's fire to light ours, and immediately I knew that I would have to provide wood for the fire until I went to bed. They passed out beers at around 3 p.m., and after having 2 to 3 beers, I just wanted dinner. They made ramen noodles and cheese, which was amazing, and burgers over the fire. By this time, it would have had to have been close to 5 p.m. because it started to rain a little bit, so we took shelter, and occasionally one of them would throw some sticks on the fire and I would cut up some logs. By the time the rain stopped, it was 7 p.m. All 4 of us smoked a blunt and were sitting around the fire. After a while of just hanging out, they asked if I had any blankets. I always have blankets. Nothing special, but we've had some pretty bad snowstorms in the past, and a couple scratchy car blankets are always useful. They each got a blanket except for R, as we'll call him, who got my summer sleeping bag that I brought just in case. By now it was dark, 9 to 9:30 p.m., and the fire was getting low. I start off to find some more wood because they wanted to smoke another blunt. Now you have to understand that I'm 6 foot 5 inches and a semi-frequent user of the devil's lettuce, so my tolerance is kinda high. I return with the wood and we spark up another blunt, a smaller one, and just kinda hang out and talk and listen to music. Eventually the fire, again, dies down a little bit, and again, it's my job to get more wood. Because we had been there for a while, and there were people there before us. Most of the wood near the shelter was either really small or all used up, so I had to keep going farther and farther away from camp to find wood. 12:30 a.m., close to 50 degrees still, so we're all doing well. I have a flashlight, a really nice one that I use for scuba diving that is kinda bright, so I use it on the low setting on land. At this point, I'm far enough away from camp that my friends can't really see me. There's like an embankment between the Montour Trail and someone's driveway that you have to cross to get to more of the woods, but I'm comfortable alone because I knew what I was doing, and they could for sure hear me if I needed them. I start to hear a weird whistling sound, kinda like someone inhaling through a snorkel, but I chalk it up to the wind. The air was starting to get kinda cold, so I just took back what I had and put some on the fire. 1 to 2 a.m., around 40 degrees with some wind, nothing severe. I have on 2 long-sleeve shirts and an army surplus coat that is super warm, but my friends are in windbreakers and hoodies and, oh yeah, it's raining. Off to get more wood. This time I started taking into consideration the type of wood that I would collect. There was a lot of pine, but that burns fast, which is why I had to go collect it so often. The stretch of woods near the driveway was pretty much all pine, a few maples, but nothing big. So I keep walking, knowing that this area has both conifers and deciduous trees in close proximity to each other. As I'm wandering and collecting wood, I notice that the rain has turned to a superfine snow. Time to head back, just in case it picks up. Then, the whistling started again, a lot louder now though. Okay, weird. There isn't any more wind than there was before. Maybe it changed directions. I keep walking. By now, I can hear the music from camp and pick up the pace a little bit. Just as I summit the embankment and prepare to clamber down the other side, a loud noise echoes behind me. Did a tree fall? Shining my flashlight around, I couldn't see any signs that that was the case and didn't see any source. In my head, it doesn't matter because I'm back at camp anyway, and I can try the marsh behind our shelter next time. It was 3 a.m. now, and they were cold. The temperature dropped to around 30 now, and the wind and snow had picked up. Car blankets helped the boys a little bit, but they weren't able to go sleep in the tent that I brought without freezing, except for R, who slept like a rock all night after about 3:30. We decide to finish off the weed and give the last beers a good talking to. At 4:30 a.m., I'm about ready for bed at this point because I'm not super high or drunk or anything, but I was definitely tired. I offer to go collect more wood before I retire to my 0-degree sleeping bag and cot. I camp comfy when I don't have to carry it far, and they said they would join me. They must have been cold. We split up, and I end up heading back to where I was before, except this time I left my flashlight on high, and I made a bunch of noise to scare off that deer, or whatever was there earlier. I end up a little further away from camp than I had intended to be because there were only pine branches on the ground over here. Then the whistling starts again. This time I could tell the direction it was coming from, my left, and shined my flashlight around that area before collecting more wood. Then the sound stops briefly, then picks up again in a different direction less than a minute later, this time in front of me and a little to the right, back into the pines. Maybe the branches of certain trees catch the wind just right and are making the noise. I think about it for a moment and move on. Then, on my way back, the noise was following me, darting from left to right, but always like right behind me. I don't see anything. Then the noise makes one sharp whistle and pauses, then I hear it.
Damn, it's cold out here.
It was R, but I couldn't find him with my flashlight, so I called, "Where are you?" And it sounded like he turned around because I heard a branch snap and a bit of movement. I pointed my flashlight at where the sound was coming from, and I didn't see R anywhere. Maybe he's behind a bush or a tree or something. I call out again, "R?" No reply this time. He might be lost or something because we weren't at camp, and he saw my flashlight moving, so he came to look. "R, where are you?" Nothing. Then, louder,
It's so cold.
"I'm going back to camp because I thought he was trying to scare me."
Help!
Shining my flashlight around one last time, I spot something dive into a bush about 40 feet from where I had heard R turn around.
Help me!
"I see you, big man. Grab some wood and come back." He's 6 feet tall and 250 pounds. I shine the light around for a few more seconds, then turn around again and start walking. The whistling is back. Cool. Love that. No matter what speed I moved at, it always seemed the same distance away. I decide that I just kind of sit under a tree and wait for R to pass by, because he had to come back sometime, right? I wanted to save the battery of my flashlight, so I turned it off and closed one eye, so it would adjust faster.
Help!
By now, the snow had picked up a good bit, which is another reason to stop in case R got lost. I couldn't really see super far because there was a lot of cloud cover despite it being a full moon. The whistling never got closer, but it did start to move around a little bit in a really odd circle. It would start in one spot, stop, then promptly start in another spot that was in a different direction.
It's so cold.
I realized that it had to be the wind or something because it was moving super fast and was moving at random. Cool. Now, where the fuck is R? I turn on my flashlight between whistles and call out again, "R?" It's important to note here that the whistling never picked up while I looked around. It normally only stopped for a second or two. It was super quiet. The snow was laying on the ground, and we had 2 to 3 inches on the ground by now, so maybe that muffled it. Anyways, upon not hearing R, I thought that maybe I missed him, or didn't hear him at all, and started to head back to camp. As I stood up and brushed the dirt off my ass, I shined the flashlight around one more time. I was thinking,
Help!
I definitely heard him. After I stood up with the wood in my arms and began to walk back towards camp, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye.
Help me!
My flashlight, being a diving light, has a wrist mount that I was wearing so I could use it and carry things. I turned towards the area with my flashlight, scanned it, nothing. Fucking deer. Not even 4 steps more, and I saw another movement. Now the whistling was back. Damn, that gets annoying. Flashlight was on low, so I could see maybe 40 feet around me and didn't see anything, but I knew it was time to pick up the pace. Now the whistling was followed by flashes of movement. Great, it's not the wind. At this point, I'm speed walking. Being tall, I can move if I have to, and I was definitely traveling at jogging speed. A lumbering beast when he runs, could not move this fast or this quietly through the woods. Nice, another thing that it's not. I decided to turn off the flashlight and move into some brush that was close by. Not sure why, but I was getting a little weirded out and had the shakes even though I was warm. It was silent again. Well, fuck me, what is it? Is it hunting me? There was a good period of silence, then there was whistling. This time, it wasn't doing circles around me, it was just moving around where I had turned off the flashlight. My eyes adjusted, and I peeked out from under the bush that I was rolled up under. Nothing. Just that damned whistling. By this point, I was pretty much sober, like if I got pulled over, I could nail the field sobriety test. I waited for a little while, the thing just kinda looked around. Then I heard it speak. In a really gargled impression of me, it called out, "Hey, big man!" It took everything I had not to panic. Holy shit. Not R, not human, not a deer, not the wind. Oh fuck. Then, it spoke again. "Hey, R," cutting off really strangely, like you just lifted the needle off of a record, but picking back up again with, "Let's get back to camp." Still in my voice. My fucking voice. I normally don't like hearing recordings of myself anyways, but now I really don't like them. It said a few more things, in different voices that I didn't recognize. All the voices were either talking about how cold it was or questions like, "What was that?" and "Stop fucking with me," but they all seemed like whoever was talking had some phlegm built up in their throat. Then it went quiet. I poked my head out of the bushes again and saw something sitting against a tree in the same position I had been in, left leg straight out, right leg at an angle, hands behind my head. It could have fooled me as being R. We both kinda sit the same way, except his ADHD usually makes him fidget with his hands. Okay, so who's sitting in the woods with me? I lay there, silent, and just watch. It begins to whistle. So that's where that was coming from. It moves its hand around in a fist out in front of it, the same way that I look around with my flashlight and then started to stand up. Oh fuck, it's tall. I only weigh 170 pounds, skin and bone mostly, so when I say that, this thing was skinny, don't take it lightly. I could see how thin its long, spindly arms were silhouetted against the snow that coated a bush behind it. When it stood up, it was hunched over, not sure if I was slouching when I stood up, but I certainly do slouch. It walked a few paces away from the tree and stood up the whole way. Holy shit. I worked with backdrops for theater productions, and the walls we use the most are around 8 feet high, and this thing would have easily been able to see over one. I'm talking by at least a foot. It slowly peered around, no hair on its head, and its side profile showed a super disfigured skull. The jaw hung pretty far down, and there weren't really lips that stuck out, but it was hard to tell because of how dark it was. It let out one final, "Hey, big man!" Then it screamed. My dad used to take me to air shows a lot as a kid, and this has to have been the same pitch and volume as an F-16. It peered around, head just seemingly sweeping the area. Then it crouches down and leaps for a tree with the lowest branch being around 10-15 feet and lands feet first on one of the branches and sits there, squatting, whistling, and just staring around. Then it takes off, faster than should be allowed in nature. I count to 10 in my head, and the forest sleeps. I slowly make my way out from under the bush and begin to creep back towards camp. This time, avoiding using my flashlight or making any noise if possible. I climb the embankment and take one last look towards the woods, unsure if that just happened or if I was asleep. I tumble down the other side of the embankment and return to the relative safety of the big-ass fire with Y and J, the other two who went for wood. "Where's your wood?" asks Y. "Oh, it, had bugs. It's fine, we got a lot anyways." They stacked up a solid pile of oak and pine, not enough for the night, but enough for a little while at least. "Where's R?" I ask warily. "Check the tent." There he was, passed the fuck out, snoring the way he always does. I climbed into my sleeping bag to warm up a little bit because I was covered in snow when I got back and it screamed again. "Oh, please don't tell me it's coming here." The other two looked at me wide-eyed. Normally, if I recognize a sound, I say what it is out loud so they know what's up. I had no response. They asked if I heard the first one. I answered with a nod as I unlocked the car in case we needed to take off quick. They asked if I saw it. I nodded yes. What was it? No fucking clue. I described it to them quietly so that I could listen for more noises, and I told them about it imitating my voice. Y was pretty freaked out. Jay thought I was bullshitting him and said it was some kind of owl. I got out of my sleeping bag, threw my coat back on, and joined them at the fire. For the first time in a while, I looked at my phone, 5:45 a.m. We looked up native owl calls and came up empty-handed. The same happened with every other animal we tried. Jay seemed a little nervous. Y suggested that maybe it's a truck on the highway. "Yeah, that's probably it," I replied blankly, and Jay gave me a look that said that he knew it probably wasn't. They didn't sleep. I forced sleep upon myself so that we wouldn't die on the car ride home. The next morning, we went for a walk. It didn't snow much after I got back, so you could kind of follow my footprints. The tree the thing leapt into was out of reach of me on Jay's shoulders. R was still asleep, but I think I might have been able to reach it if I was on his shoulders instead. The tree I sat under had scratch marks on it. I think they're from deer shedding the velvet off of their antlers, but it creeped me out nonetheless. The tree it sat under had footprints everywhere. There seemed to be no order to them at all. It was amazing. It looked like it had run over every square inch of that area, coming within 2 feet of the bush I was in. I don't really know much about cryptids or anything, but when I got home, I Googled North American tall, skinny cryptid, and the second result was from Parade, a list of cryptids. After ruling out everything else on the list, I came across the picture of a Wendigo that has antlers. Not quite, but pretty close, described as tall and skinny and super fast. I did my research, and every picture has antlers, but I can't find any evidence that, other than a few movies, it had antlers. Who the fuck knows, really? What I saw definitely didn't have antlers, but it matched everything else, even down to the whistling.
That's all for tonight, dear listeners. Until next time, I'll be leaving you in the dark where whispers linger and shadows dance. Stay wary, sleep well, and beware the Wendigo in the woods. If you have a story to tell, please reach out via email at contact@campfirecultpod.com or leave me a voicemail message at 720-297-8608. You can follow us anywhere on social media at Campfire Cult Pod and online at campfirecultpod.com. And finally, if you don't mind, please rate and review wherever possible.